My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 35, living in a quiet suburb outside Boston, the kind of place where people wave at each other even when they don't like each other. If you had seen my life from the outside, you would have said it was calm, stable, maybe even perfect. A husband who came home at the same time every evening. A small house with white curtains. A kitchen that always smelled like coffee and toast in the mornings. But the truth doesn't sit nicely in pictures. It started small. That's what I always tell myself when I try to understand how I ended up here. Small things don't feel dangerous at first. It was a work meeting. Just another Tuesday. I remember the office lights were too bright, the kind that make everyone look a little more tired than they are. I was standing near the copier, waiting for my documents, when I first heard his voice. You always look like you're thinking too loud. I turned around. Daniel Hayes. Marketing consultant. Temporary assignment. He wasn't unusually handsome in a dramatic way. It was something calmer than that. The way he stood like he had nowhere else to be except right there in that moment. I laughed without meaning to. Is that a compliment or an insult? Depends, he said, leaning slightly against the wall. Are your thoughts usually kind to you? I should have just taken my papers and walked away. Instead, I smiled again. And that was the first mistake I noticed later. Days passed, and somehow conversations started building themselves between us. In hallways. In elevators. Between deadlines and meetings that felt endless. He had a way of talking that made ordinary moments feel like they mattered more than they should. One evening, I stayed late to finish a report. The office was almost empty, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside the glass windows. I remember packing my things when I heard footsteps. You're still here, he said. I didn't look up right away. So are you? Yeah, he smiled, but I had a feeling you'd still be here too. That made me pause. Why would you think that? He shrugged. People like you don't leave things unfinished. People like me. I didn't ask what he meant by that. I should have. Instead, I closed my laptop and said, well, I'm done now. We walked out of the building together. The night air was colder than expected, and I remember pulling my coat tighter as we stood outside. You always walk home like you're being followed by your own thoughts, he said casually. I laughed. Maybe I am. Do they ever catch you? That question stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. At home, everything looked the same. My husband, Mark, was watching TV when I came in. He asked me how work was. I said fine. He nodded without looking away from the screen. We ate dinner quietly. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, just familiar. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about nothing and everything at the same time. And I hated myself a little for remembering Daniel's voice more clearly than my husband's that day. The next week, it happened again. Then again. Always by coincidence. Always just work. But coincidences start to feel like patterns when they repeat enough times. One afternoon, he said something that didn't sound like a joke anymore. You ever feel like your life is already written, and you're just reading it too slowly to notice the ending? I looked at him carefully then. That's a strange thing to say. Maybe, he admitted. But don't you ever wonder if you could step off the page? I didn't answer. Because I did wonder. That night, I came home later than usual. Mark didn't ask why. Or maybe he did and I just didn't hear him properly. I stood in the kitchen alone after he went to bed, the light above the counter buzzing faintly. And for the first time, I felt something dangerous. Not love. Not even attraction yet. Just attention. The kind of attention that makes you feel seen in places you forgot existed. And somewhere in that quiet kitchen light, I realized something I didn't want to admit. I was starting to wait for someone who wasn't my husband. I told myself I would keep it simple after that. Just work. Just conversations. Just normal. That word, normal, started to feel like something I was pretending to understand. Daniel didn't act like anything had changed. That was the strange part. He never pushed, never rushed, never made things obvious. It made it harder to justify the unease growing inside me, because nothing technically looked wrong. But sometimes the most dangerous things don't announce themselves. They just quietly become part of your routine. He started appearing in the small gaps of my day. A quick good morning before meetings. A shared joke in the hallway that made me smile longer than I should have. A glance that lasted half a second too long before we both looked away like nothing happened. One afternoon, I was fixing my hair in the office restroom mirror when I heard two co-workers talking behind me. You know, he's been asking about her a lot. I froze slightly, not turning around. Claire. Yeah. The quiet one from finance. I think he likes her. A nervous laugh followed. He likes everyone until he doesn't. I washed my hands slowly, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but my reflection felt different after that. Like I'd been placed under a light I didn't choose. When I stepped out, Daniel was standing near the vending machine. As if he had been waiting. You look like you just heard a secret, he said lightly. I might have, I replied. His eyes narrowed slightly, playful but careful. Good secret or bad secret? I hesitated. Depends on who it's about. That made him quiet for a second. Just one. Then he smiled again, softer this time. Fair enough. We stood there longer than we needed to. The vending machine hummed between us like it was trying to fill the silence. I don't usually talk to people here, I said finally. Neither do I, he replied. That's not true. He tilted his head. Why? Because you talk to everyone. That made him laugh, real and warm, like I'd caught him off guard. You've been watching me? I felt heat rise in my face immediately. That's not what I meant. I know, he said, still smiling. But I like that you noticed. Something in my chest tightened at that. Not comfort. Not exactly. Something closer to recognition. Later that day, we got assigned to the same project. Of course we did. 2 weeks. Tight deadline. Shared responsibility. The kind of setup that makes avoidance impossible without looking strange. Our first meeting was in a small conference room with a glass wall overlooking the city. Rain tapped softly against it, blurring the skyline into something almost abstract. We sat across from each other. Laptop open. Papers spread. Professional distance carefully maintained. At least that's what it was supposed to be. Okay, he said, tapping his pen once, let's pretend we don't already know we're going to disagree on half of this. I blinked. We are. Oh, absolutely. I couldn't help it, I laughed. A short, surprised sound that felt too honest for a meeting room. He looked at me like that sound mattered more than it should have. And then we started working. Time moved differently in that room. Minutes didn't feel like minutes. Conversations folded into each other. Arguments softened into understanding. Silence didn't feel empty, it felt charged. At some point, I stopped noticing the rain. At some point, I stopped noticing everything except him. You overthink structure, he said at one point, leaning back in his chair. And you underestimate it, I replied instantly. He nodded slowly. Maybe I like chaos more than I should. That's not a good thing, I said. No, he agreed quietly. But it's honest. That word hung in the air longer than expected. Honest. When the meeting finally ended, the room felt colder, like something had been left behind when we stood up. He gathered his things slower than me. You're good at this, he said. I paused. At work. At seeing patterns, he corrected. Even the ones people try to hide. I looked at him carefully then. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It is, he said. Then after a pause, softer, I think you know more about people than you let on. That stayed with me as I left the building that evening. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy. I walked toward the bus stop, holding my bag tighter than usual. Halfway there, my phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. It was short. You walk like you're always leaving something behind. My heart didn't jump immediately. It sank. Because I already knew. I didn't need a name to recognize the voice anymore. I stood there under the dim streetlight, staring at the screen until it blurred slightly. Then another message came in. I hope it's not me. And for the first time, I didn't know whether I should smile, feel afraid, or delete everything and pretend it never happened. Instead, I just stood there, quiet, as the city moved around me like nothing had changed. But something already had. And I could feel it pulling me forward, even as every sensible part of me tried to stay still. I didn't reply that night. Not because I was strong, or careful, or in control. I just didn't know how. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have, glowing softly in the dark like it had taken up residence in my thoughts. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there, listening to the refrigerator hum like it was trying to keep me grounded. Mark was already asleep when I came home. The house felt normal in the way it always did at night, quiet, settled, predictable. That kind of quiet can either calm you down or make your thoughts louder. Mine were louder. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat down I didn't relax in. And every few minutes, my hand drifted toward my phone like it had its own memory. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. A joke. A coincidence. Maybe even a wrong number. But the mind doesn't let things go that easily once they've been noticed. At work, I kept my distance. At least I tried to. Daniel arrived later than usual that day. When he walked in, I felt it immediately, like a shift in pressure in the room that nobody else seemed to notice. He looked at me once. Just once. And smiled like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't spent half the night thinking about words sent from nowhere that somehow felt like they belonged only to me. During a meeting, I caught myself watching him instead of the presentation. It wasn't intentional. It just happened. The way he leaned forward when he was thinking. The way his pen tapped softly against the table when he disagreed with something. The calm certainty in his voice even when he was wrong. And then, like he could feel it, he looked up. Our eyes met. Not long. Not dramatic. Just enough. I looked away first. My heart didn't race like in movies. It tightened. Like something inside me had been gently, quietly disturbed. After work, I found myself walking slower than usual. And then I heard footsteps behind me. Claire. I stopped before I turned. Because I already knew. When I faced him, Daniel wasn't smiling this time. Not fully. You didn't reply, he said. I tried to keep my voice steady. To what? He raised an eyebrow slightly. You know. A pause. The air between us felt thinner than it should have. I didn't know I was supposed to, I said. That made him exhale softly, almost like a laugh that didn't fully come out. I wasn't sure you would. I folded my arms. Then why send it? He looked at me for a moment, and for the first time, I noticed something different in his expression. Not confidence. Not playfulness. Something closer to uncertainty. Because I was thinking about you, he said simply. No decoration. No exaggeration. Just that. It hit harder than I expected. Not because it was dramatic. Because it wasn't. I looked away first this time. A car passed behind us, headlights sweeping across the sidewalk, and for a second everything felt unreal, like the world had paused just long enough for that sentence to exist. That's not appropriate, I said quietly. He nodded once. I know. Silence. Then he added, softer, I didn't say it was. That confused me more than anything else. If it wasn't appropriate, why say it? I should have walked away right then. That would have been the sensible ending to this moment. Instead, I stayed. And that was the second mistake I noticed later. I shouldn't have your number, I said. I didn't get it from anywhere official, he replied quickly. Then, almost immediately, I won't use it again if you don't want me to. There it was again. Control given back to me too late to feel simple. I should have said stop. I should have said don't. I should have said this is wrong in the clearest possible way. Instead, I asked something I didn't understand even as I said it. Why me? He blinked slightly, like he hadn't expected that question. Then he looked down for a moment, as if choosing something honest over something safe. Because you're the only person who looks at me like I'm not already decided, he said. That didn't make sense at first. But somehow, it did. We stood there longer than we should have again. It was becoming a pattern I was starting to recognize too well. Finally, I stepped back. I need to go, I said. He nodded. Okay. But neither of us moved immediately. That was the worst part. The moments that don't end when they're supposed to. That night, I deleted the message. Then I checked if I had really deleted it. Then I checked my deleted folder. Then I closed my phone and put it across the room. And still, I couldn't stop thinking about the words. You walk like you're always leaving something behind. I lay in bed beside Mark, listening to his breathing, steady and unaware. And I realized something I didn't want to name. Nothing had physically changed yet. But something inside me was no longer fully where it used to be. And worse than that, part of me was starting to notice when it wasn't there. I stopped replying after that. At least I told myself I did. Because silence sounds clean in theory, but in reality it has cracks. Small ones at first. Easy to ignore. Then wider ones when you're not paying attention. Daniel didn't message again for 2 days. And those 2 days felt louder than the days before them. At work, everything stayed professional on the surface. Meetings, deadlines, quick exchanges that could pass as nothing more than routine. But I started noticing how often I noticed him. Not where he was. Where he wasn't. That absence shouldn't have mattered. It did anyway. On the 3rd day, I was alone in the break room when he walked in. He paused when he saw me. Just for a second. Like he was checking something unspoken. Then he stepped inside. Coffee? He asked casually. I hesitated. I was just leaving. He nodded slowly. Right. But neither of us moved. The machine whirred softly, filling the silence between us with artificial noise that didn't help anything. Finally, I said, you stopped messaging. It came out more direct than I intended. He looked at me, studying my face like he was trying to decide how honest he was allowed to be. I said I wouldn't if you didn't want it, he replied. That's not what I meant. A pause. The kind that makes you realize words have weight before they even land. Then he asked quietly, do you want me to? I didn't answer immediately. Because that question wasn't simple. It wasn't about messages. It was about something I hadn't fully admitted even to myself yet. I don't know, I said finally. And for some reason, that made him exhale like he'd been holding something in. That's more honest than most people get, he said. I looked at him sharply. That's not a good thing. No, he agreed. But it's real. Real. That word again. It started to feel like a thread pulling through everything. I poured coffee I didn't want just to have something to do with my hands. You shouldn't make things complicated at work, I said. I'm not trying to, he replied. I almost laughed at that. Almost. Because nothing about this felt simple anymore. You're not helping either, he added, softer. That made me look up. He wasn't smiling this time. He wasn't performing confidence or charm or anything easy to dismiss. He just looked present. And that was worse. Because it made it harder to pretend this was one-sided. I have a life, I said quietly. I know, he replied. That was all he said. No argument. No pressure. Just acknowledgement. And somehow that made it heavier. I left the break room first. Of course I did. But halfway down the hallway, I stopped. Because my phone buzzed. I already knew before I looked. Unknown number again. You still walk like you're leaving something behind. My breath caught slightly, not dramatically, just enough to make me aware of it. Then another message came. But you're standing still more often now. My fingers tightened around the phone. I didn't turn around. But I knew without looking. He was somewhere behind me. Not close enough to touch. Close enough to feel. I walked outside fast, like movement could undo what I was thinking. The air was colder than I expected. Or maybe I just noticed it more. That evening at home, everything felt slightly delayed. Mark asked about my day. I answered too quickly. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to. We watched TV together without really watching it. At some point, he fell asleep beside me. I stayed awake. And for the first time, I didn't just think about Daniel. I thought about the gap forming inside my days. The part of me that existed when he was present. And the part that didn't know how to behave when he wasn't. It scared me in a quiet way. Not dramatic. Just steady. Because I realized something I hadn't been ready to accept. This wasn't happening all at once. It was happening in small permissions. Tiny ones. The kind you don't notice until you've already said yes without speaking. And somewhere in that silence, I understood something else too. Even if I stopped it now, it had already learned my rhythm. I started doubting my own memory. Not in a dramatic way. In small moments that didn't feel important enough to question, until they did. Like whether I had actually heard his voice first, or if I had been waiting for it without realizing. Like whether the messages had really felt sudden, or if I had simply been pretending not to expect them. The mind is strange like that. It doesn't always lie. Sometimes it just edits. At work, Daniel acted the same as before. That was the most confusing part. He didn't corner me emotionally. He didn't force conversations. He didn't make anything obvious for anyone else to see. But when we did speak, something had changed. A softness in the pauses. A weight in the silences. Like we were both aware of something sitting just beneath every normal sentence. One afternoon, we were reviewing project notes together. Just the two of us again. The office almost empty. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You're quieter than usual." I didn't look up right away. Am I? Yes. That simple answer made me pause. I finally met his eyes. Maybe I'm just focusing. He studied me for a second too long. No, he said gently. It's different. I felt something tighten in my chest. Because he was right. But I didn't want him to be. What do you want from me, Daniel? I asked before I could stop myself. The room shifted slightly after I said it. Even the air felt like it paused to listen. He didn't answer immediately. And that silence did something strange. It didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like honesty waiting to form. I don't want anything from you, he said finally. I let out a small, humorless breath. That's not true. He nodded once. Okay. Then I want something simple. I frowned slightly. Nothing about this is simple. That made him smile faintly, but not in a playful way. I want you to stop looking like you're somewhere else when you're talking to me, he said quietly. That hit harder than I expected. Because I hadn't realized I was doing it. Or maybe I had. And just didn't want to admit why. I am here, I said. He tilted his head slightly. Part of you is. That sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. Part of you is. I looked down at the table. Because I didn't have a clean answer for that. That night, I tried to remember the last time I had felt fully present in my own life. Not half thinking about something else. Not waiting for something. Just existing without noticing myself doing it. I couldn't find it. At home, Mark asked if I wanted to go visit his parents this weekend. I nodded without really hearing him. He smiled like that was enough. Later, I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair, staring at my reflection a little too long. It felt familiar. But not fully mine. Like I was borrowing myself for a while. My phone lit up on the counter. I froze before even touching it. Unknown number. You're starting to notice the distance too. My breath slowed. I didn't reply. Another message came. That's the part that changes everything. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub without realizing I had moved. My reflection watched me from the mirror like it didn't fully trust me either. Because something strange was happening. It wasn't just Daniel anymore. It wasn't just messages. It was the way my thoughts started finishing themselves in his voice. The way silence started sounding like him. The way ordinary moments at home felt slightly out of place, like I had stepped into a version of my life that had been rearranged while I wasn't paying attention. And the most unsettling part wasn't that I wanted to respond. It was that I was beginning to understand what he meant before he even said it. As if my mind had already started learning a language I hadn't agreed to speak. I turned off my phone. Then turned it back on again. Then locked it. Then placed it face down like that could stop anything. And in the quiet of the bathroom, I whispered something I didn't mean to say out loud. This isn't me. But even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure who I was talking about. By the time I noticed it becoming a habit, it was already too late to call it new. It wasn't excitement anymore. It wasn't confusion either. It was repetition. The kind that slips into your day so naturally you stop recognizing it as something separate from you. I would wake up and reach for my phone before I even fully remembered why. Not to check messages. Just to check absence. And somehow that felt worse than seeing anything there. At work, Daniel and I didn't talk more than necessary. But necessary had started to expand. A comment about the project. A correction on a report. A shared glance when something didn't add up. And every interaction left a trace that didn't fade when it was supposed to. One afternoon, I found myself laughing at something he said in a meeting. It wasn't even that funny. That realization came later. But in the moment, it felt easy. Natural. Like my body had decided before my mind did. After the meeting, I was packing my things when he leaned against the doorframe. "You're doing it again," he said. I glanced up. "Doing what?" "Looking like you're halfway out of the room already." I stopped for a second. Then sighed softly. "Maybe I am." That made him quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. Focused quiet. "You do that more now," he said. "What?" "Admit things before you decide if you mean them." I felt my chest tighten slightly. "That's not a good thing," I said automatically. He nodded slowly. "No. But it's honest." I almost told him to stop saying that word. Honest. Because it was starting to feel like a trap I kept walking into willingly. Instead, I asked, "Why are you always noticing me?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower. "Because you're the only thing in this place that doesn't feel automatic." That sentence didn't feel like flattery. It felt like recognition I wasn't sure I had asked for. I left the office earlier than usual that day. But I didn't go straight home. I sat in my car for a long time without starting the engine. Just thinking. Or trying not to think. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "You're starting to look for me when I'm not there." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Another message came before I could decide what to do. "That's how it starts becoming yours." I turned the phone face down. And stayed still until my breathing felt normal again. But even then, something inside me didn't fully settle. At home, Mark was cooking dinner. He asked me something about my day. I answered correctly. I even smiled at the right moment. Everything looked intact from the outside. That was the strange part. Nothing looked broken. But I felt like I was learning how to exist in two versions of the same day. One where I was just Claire. And another where I was someone slightly different. Someone who noticed silence more than sound. Later that night, I stood by the kitchen window after Mark went to bed. The street outside was quiet. Ordinary. Safe-looking. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in me that didn't care about safety in the same way anymore. My phone was on the counter. Face down again. Like it always was now. But I wasn't thinking about picking it up. Not exactly. I was thinking about what would happen if I did. And worse than that. I was realizing I was no longer afraid of the answer. Just curious. And that curiosity didn't feel like an emotion anymore. It felt like a direction I was slowly starting to face. I started noticing how often I explained myself in my own head. Not to other people. To myself. Why I stayed a little longer at work. Why I replayed conversations. Why I felt disappointed when nothing came through on my phone. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. But together, they didn't feel like me anymore. They felt like someone trying to convince herself she was still in control. Daniel didn't change. That was the part that unsettled me the most. He didn't push further. He didn't pull away either. He stayed in that same careful space between distance and presence, like he understood something I was still pretending not to. But I felt myself changing around him anyway. One evening, we were finishing late again. The office had that half-empty sound it gets when most people have already left, like the building is exhaling slowly. I was packing my bag when he spoke. "You look tired." I paused. "I am tired." That made him glance at me more closely. Not just from work, he said. I should have shut it down there. Simple sentence. Simple boundary. Instead, I asked, what do you think it is then? He didn't smile this time. That you're carrying two conversations at once, he said. I frowned slightly. I don't understand. He picked up his pen, turning it slowly between his fingers. One is what you say, he continued. The other is what you don't let yourself finish. My chest tightened. That doesn't make sense. It does, he said softly. You just don't like it. I looked away first. Not because I was angry, because I didn't want him to see how accurate it felt. After a moment, I said, you talk like you know me. He let out a quiet breath. I'm trying to, he replied. That sentence stayed there longer than it should have. Trying to. Not claiming. Not assuming. Just continuing. When we left the building, the night air felt heavier than usual. We walked in the same direction for a while without discussing it. Side by side. Not too close. Not far enough apart to feel separate. At one point, my phone buzzed in my bag. I didn't check it immediately. That alone surprised me. Daniel noticed. He didn't say anything, but I felt it. You're getting better at ignoring it, he said after a while. I looked at him sharply. At what? He nodded toward my bag. That. I swallowed slightly. It's just messages. Everything is just messages until it isn't, he said. I stopped walking for half a second. Then kept going. Because stopping felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to name. When I finally checked my phone later, there was nothing new. And I hated how relieved I felt. That night at home, I sat at the dining table long after dinner was finished. Mark was watching something on TV. Laughing at the right moments. Living in a world that still felt complete. I looked at him and felt a strange distance I couldn't explain. Not emotional distance. Something worse. Perceptual distance. Like I was watching a life I technically belonged to but didn't fully occupy anymore. I went to the bathroom and locked the door. Just for a minute. Just to breathe. My reflection looked back at me like it had been waiting. And I realized something I hadn't fully accepted yet. There wasn't a clear moment where things changed. No single decision. No obvious crossing. Just repetition. And now I couldn't tell whether I was resisting something. Or already participating in it quietly. My phone lit up again. Unknown number. You're not resisting as much as you used to. My stomach tightened. Another message came. That's how you know it's becoming real. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was afraid. But because part of me was trying to understand why it felt true. And in that silence, I noticed something I didn't like admitting. I wasn't asking who was sending the messages anymore. I was starting to wonder what they would say next. And that question felt like the first time I had stopped arguing with the direction of my own thoughts. I began to lose trust in ordinary moments. Not because anything dramatic was happening. Because nothing was. That was the problem. Everything looked the same, sounded the same, continued the same. But I didn't feel positioned inside it the way I used to. It was like standing slightly to the side of my own life, watching it happen at a distance I couldn't measure. At work, Daniel and I were still just colleagues in every visible way. But the invisible part had grown louder than anything we actually said. A glance in a meeting would stay with me longer than the meeting itself. A pause in conversation would repeat in my head on the drive home. Even silence felt like it had meaning now. One afternoon, we were alone again in the conference room. Rain pressed against the windows, soft and steady. I was supposed to be reviewing notes. Instead, I found myself staring at the same line of text without processing it. You're not reading, Daniel said gently. I blinked. I am. He tilted his head slightly. No, you're somewhere else. I exhaled slowly. I don't know where somewhere else is anymore. That made him stop what he was doing. Not dramatically. Just fully. Like he'd been waiting for me to say something close to that. You've been saying that more, he said. What? Things that sound like you're trying to locate yourself. I looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time, I felt something uncomfortable. Not attraction. Not confusion. Recognition of dependence forming in places I hadn't agreed to. I'm fine, I said quickly. But it didn't land the way I wanted it to. He didn't challenge it. He didn't agree either. Instead, he said quietly, "You don't sound fine when you say it like that." That sentence should have been harmless. It wasn't. Because it implied he knew a version of me I hadn't fully admitted existed yet. After work, I didn't go home immediately again. I sat near the river walkway instead, watching water move without effort, like it didn't need permission to keep going. My phone buzzed. I hesitated before checking it. Unknown number. You're noticing the difference between what you say and what you feel. My throat tightened slightly. Another message came before I could respond. That's why you feel split. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Because I didn't know how it could sound so accurate without being said out loud. I turned the phone off. But the words didn't turn off with it. At home that night, Mark asked if I wanted to go away for a weekend soon. I nodded. Then paused. Then nodded again. He smiled like that meant something stable. I smiled back like I agreed. But later, lying in bed, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember the last conversation I had fully entered without mentally stepping out of it halfway through. Not just with Mark. With everything. Except. I stopped that thought before it finished. Because there was one exception forming that I didn't want to define too clearly. The problem wasn't that Daniel was becoming important. The problem was that I was starting to notice how empty things felt when he wasn't part of the moment in some indirect way. Even when he wasn't present. Especially when he wasn't present. And that wasn't attraction anymore. That was structure. Something my mind was beginning to build around him without asking for permission. I lay there in the dark, listening to Mark's steady breathing. And I realized something that made my stomach tighten quietly. If someone asked me right now what I was holding on to, I wasn't sure I would answer with my actual life. I might answer with the thought that kept returning instead. And that thought didn't feel like a choice anymore. It felt like a place I kept finding myself returning to. Even when I didn't mean to. Even when I told myself I wouldn't. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing ever does, not really. It happened in the way a glass fills, drop by drop, until suddenly you realize it's already full and still being poured into. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. Not because I was getting ready slowly. Because I couldn't tell if I recognized myself quickly enough. My reflection looked normal. That was always the most unsettling part. Normal didn't mean whole anymore. At work, Daniel didn't say anything different at first. We were still inside the same routines. Same reports. Same conversations that could pass as nothing important to anyone watching. But something between us had shifted into a quieter honesty, like we'd both stopped pretending we didn't feel the weight of what we weren't saying. Later in the afternoon, the office was almost empty again. Of course it was. It always seemed to be when things became harder to ignore. He walked into the conference room after me, closing the door gently behind him. No urgency. No tension in his movements. Just certainty that this moment was already happening. "You're thinking too loud again," he said. I let out a short breath. "You always say that." "Because it's always true when I say it." I looked down at the table. "My thoughts aren't your responsibility," I said quietly. He nodded once. "I know." A pause. Then he added, softer, "But they've started sounding like they're answering me sometimes." That made me look up immediately. "Don't say things like that." He didn't flinch. "I'm not creating it," he said. That sentence landed heavier than I expected. Because he wasn't pushing. He was describing. And I couldn't decide which was worse. "I have a life," I said again, like repetition could stabilize it. "I know you do," he replied. But this time, it sounded like he was including it in something, not denying it. I stood up too quickly. "I shouldn't be doing this," I said. His expression didn't change. Just softened slightly. "I know," he repeated. That was it. No argument. No insistence. No attempt to pull me back or forward. Just acceptance. And somehow that made my chest tighten more than resistance would have. I grabbed my bag. I need to go. He stepped slightly aside, giving me space. But before I reached the door, he spoke again. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady. Claire. I stopped. Not because I wanted to. Because something in my body responded before I could decide. I don't think you're confused, he said quietly. That made my fingers tighten around my bag strap. I think you're just finally noticing what you've been avoiding. Silence. Longer than before. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. I'm not asking you to choose anything, he added. That should have helped. It didn't. Because it meant the choice was already happening inside me without permission. I left the room without replying. Outside, the air felt too sharp. Like it had been waiting for me to step into it. That night, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't sit with Mark. I didn't check messages immediately either. I just stood in the kitchen, hands on the counter, staring at nothing in particular while everything in my head refused to stay still. Eventually, I looked at my phone. Unknown number. You're not resisting anymore. My breath caught slightly. Another message came almost immediately. You're just deciding how to feel about it. I closed my eyes for a second. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I was tired of how accurate it felt. When I opened them again, I realized something that scared me in a quiet, clean way. I wasn't reacting to the messages like an interruption anymore. I was reacting to them like confirmation. As if something inside me had already started forming its own answers before I ever read the words. And worse. Those answers didn't feel foreign. They felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain without trusting them. I turned off my phone. Then turned it back on. Then stared at it longer than I should have. Until I admitted something I had been circling for too long. This wasn't about messages. This wasn't about timing or coincidence or even Daniel in isolation. It was about the version of me that responded differently every time he was involved. And that version didn't feel like it was disappearing. It felt like it was becoming more consistent than the other one. I sat down slowly. Because suddenly standing felt too honest. And in the quiet of that room, I understood something I hadn't wanted to reach. I wasn't standing at a crossroads. I had already been walking one direction for a while. I was just finally noticing the path under my feet. The morning of the final day felt ordinary in the most deceptive way. Sunlight through the curtains. The sound of dishes in the sink. Mark humming something low while making coffee like every other morning that had ever happened in this house. Nothing in the room suggested endings were possible. And yet, everything in me felt like it was already standing inside one. I moved through the routine carefully, like small actions could keep reality stable. Brush teeth. Get dressed. Say the right responses at the right time. Mark kissed my cheek before leaving for work. Busy day, he said. I nodded. Yeah. He smiled, not noticing the distance in my voice or maybe choosing not to. See you tonight. See you. The door closed. And the house didn't feel empty right away. It felt delayed, like it was still waiting for the version of me that used to exist inside it. My phone sat on the counter. I didn't touch it at first. That alone felt strange now. Eventually, I picked it up. Unknown number. One message. You don't need me to tell you what you already know. My breathing slowed. Not because I was shocked. Because I wasn't. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of something that didn't feel external anymore. It felt like agreement. Not from him. From me. The truth I had been avoiding wasn't that something had been pulling me away from my life. It was that I had stopped fighting the pull a long time ago. My mind drifted back not to one moment, but to all of them layered together. The conversations that felt too meaningful to dismiss. The silences that felt too loud to ignore. The version of myself that felt more awake when he was part of my thoughts. Even when he wasn't physically there. Especially when he wasn't. I realized then that Daniel had never actually taken anything from me. He had only reflected what was already shifting inside me. And the messages? They weren't instructions. They were explanations I had been willing to understand. My phone buzzed again. But I didn't check it immediately. Instead, I walked to the window. Outside, people were moving through their lives like everything was still clearly defined. Like choices were clean. Like hearts didn't divide quietly over time. I thought about Mark. Not as a mistake. Not as something to erase. But as someone I had loved in a way that made sense at the time my life was different. And I understood something painful in its simplicity. Love doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it just stops matching the person you become. My phone buzzed again. I didn't need to look to know it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what I had become while trying not to notice it happening. I finally opened the message thread. There was no new explanation. No dramatic confession. Just a final line. You were never lost. You were just changing without admitting it. I exhaled slowly. For the first time, I didn't argue with it in my head. Because arguing would have meant pretending I still didn't understand. And I did. I understood too clearly. I set the phone down. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Just gently. Like putting down something I had been carrying for too long. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Work later. Conversations. Faces. Words that reached me but didn't fully stay. And somewhere in all of it, I saw Daniel. Not in a dramatic moment. Just briefly in a hallway. He looked at me. And for the first time, there was no searching in his expression. No uncertainty. No pulling. Just recognition. Like something between us had finally stopped pretending it was unfinished. I didn't stop walking. Neither did he. But for a second, the space between us didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding. That night, I went home and sat at the kitchen table long after everything had gone quiet again. No messages. No interruptions. No voice pulling at my attention. Just me. Fully alone in a way that no longer felt like absence. It felt like clarity. And I realized something I hadn't been able to see before all of this unfolded. The story was never about someone leading me somewhere. It was about me noticing where I had already started to go. And whether I would admit it. I looked around the house one last time. Not as something I was escaping. But as something I had once been fully inside of. And now understood differently. I didn't cry dramatically. I didn't laugh. I didn't break. I just sat there, quietly aware that life doesn't always split in obvious ways. Sometimes it just slowly rearranges you until you wake up one day and realize you're no longer standing in the same place you used to be. And that realization is its own kind of ending. Not loud. Not clean. But final enough to change everything that comes after it.